Greetings, you sexy bastards. On this fine Wednesday afternoon, I'm starting a new YouTube series called Schizophrenic Thoughts about the nature of God and reality. And the reason I'm making this series, is that what I'm supposed to? Yes. So what is this series? This series is just a compilation of all my thoughts on the nature of God and reality. It's schizophrenic because many of my thoughts are contradictory and kind of out there and are sometimes just fun things to think about but have no real bearing on life. Although much of, I think, the reason why I'm making this series, aside from the whole not having a bearing on life, is to think about God and reality and metaphysics and spirituality all in a lens of how do you actually make it practical and applicable to life, and how do you come at it from a more pragmatic lens than I think many people do. Another reason is, honestly, I think that there's a lot of lack of philosophical rigor in the church. So I'm personally Christian, and I'll talk about why in a moment. But yeah, I think there's a lot of lack of philosophical rigor in the church. So I wanted to kind of put some shit out here. Although I'm not going to act like this is really going to contain philosophical rigor. There's going to be a lot of shots in the dark and a lot of crazy theories about how things might be based on a couple of random thoughts that I've had and random ideas that I've stumbled upon out and about. So I don't really know what this is, but it's going to evolve into something. The idea, though, is I often have thoughts about the nature of God and reality. I wanted to create videos that kind of encapsulate these thoughts and try and divide them as much as possible into their own little contained videos. And then when I'm talking about this thought over here and it's dependent on this other idea that I've developed elsewhere, I can link back to that, and then they can all be little quick snippets, and at some point maybe create like a whole network of thoughts on the nature of God and reality. Anyway, so that's kind of why I'm making it, or what I'm making it, and why I'm making it is because I want to make it, and I think it'll be fun, and I like thinking about these things, and I want to have a compilation of these things. I do want to say I am no religious leader, and I am not an authority on the Bible by any means. I read the Bible, I love the Bible, but I'm not like, sitting here and researching the meanings of all of these words. I do that sometimes. I don't know all the historical context of the Bible. I don't know what the hell the Dead Sea Scrolls are. I've heard of them like 100 times. I guess it's like a copy of the Bible they found somewhere. So I've heard things, I know some things, but I'm no authority. I'm a engineering major, and I've studied a little bit of philosophy in the past. I've studied a little bit of psychology, and I think I have a good relationship with God, and that God has a powerful effect on my life and helps guide me and lead me. And when I don't listen to him, I'm like shit, and when I do listen to him, I'm like, hey, things have worked out well. So that's kind of the basis that I come to this from. A couple of topics that we'll discuss are other world religions. I may be Christian, but I don't like this perspective that you have in the church that like all the Hindus are all like demons, they're worshiping demons, and they're evil. The caste system maybe wasn't great, but I think there are a lot of really cool ideas in Hinduism. I'm a huge fan of the Bhagavad Gita. I think that's how you pronounce it. That's always how I pronounce it. But I like other world religions. I'm a huge fan of them, and I think there are two worlds of thought, but I'm going to talk about that in a video about how other religions and the Bible all interact with one another. I have many thoughts about that shit. Epistemology, metaphysics, pragmatism. We'll talk about like how do you know things? How do you learn about the nature of God? Because God is this abstract and obscure being, and we're trying to come to understand it, but we're limited in the tools that we can use to understand God, because God is beyond this world, but in some ways is within this world. So I think that'll be an interesting topic. How do we learn about the nature of God? Then I want to talk about the metaphysics of God, pragmatism. How do you make these things practical? So I think something's ability to work is evidence that its presuppositions, or the ideas and information that you've used to create that thing, prove those things. That's kind of the basis of pragmatism. Something's ability to work proves its validity as indicative of some objective truth, I think. I'll probably talk about the state of the church. I'll talk about dealing with uncertainty. I'll talk about how to reason about the divine. That's kind of like just a different way of talking about metaphysics. And then I also want to talk about the nature of sin. I think that's a fascinating idea that I think the church has kind of warped and distorted. And then the lens that I'm coming at this through, first off, I want to define God. I think many times we talk about like, hey, does God exist? Or we say like, hey, does this thing exist? And it depends on how you're defining that thing and what you mean by exist. Geez, I sound like Jordan Peterson right now. But when we're talking about electrons, for example, this kind of fucked me up recently. Electrons are weird and complicated. And for me, or for a middle schooler to say like, oh, I know that electrons exist, is kind of not true, because what they mean by an electron could be two things. One, you could see it as a limited representation of some objectively existing thing, and we'll get into all of this bullshit about the difference between objective truth, subjective truth, how you measure objective truth, if objective truth even exists, all of that BS. But we have some conception of an objective thing, and that conception is either limited or just inaccurate. And if it's inaccurate, then can you actually say that that thing exists? If somebody's conception of an electron was that it has a positive charge, and they say, I believe that electrons exist, do electrons exist? Maybe by a different definition they exist, but by that person's definition it wouldn't exist. So I think that the way that we define God is imperative to even starting to think about the nature of God. And I would say the way that I try to define God is with two key attributes, and then everything else is whatever. I think the first key attribute is that God is the creator of the universe as we know it. If we go back to the Big Bang as we understand it, we have these forces. We have 5 fundamental forces of physics. Within the realm of physics, these 5 forces, or during the Big Bang, these 5 forces, I think 2 of them existed prior to the Big Bang. And then after the Big Bang took place, it was like, some number of seconds times 10 to the negative like 29 or 37 or some bullshit like that, new forces start to pop into existence, which tells me that the very fundamental things that we understand through physics, through studying the natural world, didn't start to exist until after the Big Bang. So to some extent you can define the things that exist beyond the material world, beyond the things that physics can study, as the immaterial world. And the being or the entity that existed before that created all that allowed all that to happen, would be God. I think that's a pretty solid definition of God, the thing that lies beyond the realm that physics can understand, or at least that's what the immaterial world could represent. And God is, if there's some conscious entity within that realm that exists, then that would be God. Although applying consciousness to God is also maybe arguably not a valid thing to do. Anyway, and then the second way that I like to define God, and I think for some reason all of these world religions have defined God to be both of these things. This is something that seems to persist amongst all of these various societies and religions and perspectives and worldviews. God is the thing that existed before the universe and is the thing that created the universe, and God is also the thing, it's the spirit that guides us. And Socrates, you can see this in a couple of philosophers through the past. I think Socrates is a good example of this. I think Marcus Aurelius is a good example. Seneca talks about, to Lucius in his letters, he says, Lucius, there is a spirit within us that guides us, and we must listen to it. That's not the exact quote, but it was something like that. I've got it posted on my Instagram page. And then Marcus Aurelius often talks about listening to God. Socrates talks about his daemon, which is like his inner guide, which tells him what to do, how to live. And he always consults this inner guiding spirit before doing or saying anything. And Socrates was a pretty solid dude. So is Marcus Aurelius. Seneca, maybe, maybe not, although Seneca did talk about regretting not listening to the Spirit. Or at least the way he reflects on his life, and that quote that I mentioned kind of implies that that might be the case. Why am I Christian? Ultimately, I'm Christian because I live in a society where Christianity is kind of like the main way to connect with God. There is a Buddhist temple that my friend and I want to go and visit at some point. But I got a great church that I go to. Church is fantastic. If I didn't have this church, I probably wouldn't go to church because most other churches I've been to are kind of like a bunch of BS. I went to one. I'm pretty sure they were playing a clap track during it. I was like, bro, that's so bad. But the church I go to, like, everyone's hooting and hollering. It's very, it's got a really strong community, which I love. And then, yeah, I found a lot of utility in the Bible. I found the Bible to be accurate in describing the nature of God as I've experienced God. And the more I understand God through reading the Bible and through talking to people within the church, the more connected I feel with God. Although the same is somewhat true with Hindu and Buddhist texts, maybe, but less so. But that also might be a byproduct of my reading the Bible more. Anyway, I'm not going to get too lost in this tangent. Finally, intellectually, the way I like to pursue this is, I guess, somewhat complicated, and I guess that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this series is how do you think about the nature of God. I think it's important to, as I said before, kind of follow an approach of pragmatism, set good metrics of success, try and determine, like, what does it look like to have a relationship with God? What is the goal of all of this? That's so fucking important. The goal of all this is to say, okay, there is this guiding spirit, and for some reason these world religions have connected this guiding spirit with the entity that existed before the material world and is the reason this material world exists. And we can interact with this entity internally somehow. And there are various ways to do this. But then what does it look like to have actually been interacting with that entity pragmatically? I think there's a reason so many pastors are like ex-meth addicts is because building a relationship with God or having a relationship with God looks like being able to transform your life in a positive way. I think that's a great metric. Something that maybe the church, I would disagree with the church in, is they think like, oh, coming to church and Christianity is the only way to connect with God. However, I would argue that that's not true. And one reason I would argue this is because recently a friend of mine read me a book, or a portion of a book, where the lady who wrote this book basically suffered with like massive depression, was like suicidal, just absolutely wrecked, and she was like sitting next to like a toilet, like on the verge of like dying inside, or maybe in real life. And she like reached out to God, and she wasn't Christian, she just reached out to God and was like, God, like, get me out of this. And God brought her to the Buddhist temples, and or Thai temples, the Thai monks, I don't know, some kind of monastery with the Eastern religions. And she meditated and became one with the monks or whatever, and learned of these other world religions, these Eastern religions, and she developed a life where she was no longer suicidal and depressed to the extent that she was before, and she attributed much of that to her relationship with God. And the way I see it, that sounds like a relationship with God, whether Christianity was a part of the picture or not. So that's kind of the metric of success that I tend to use is, what is a good way to define that metric of success? Or like this metric of whether or not you are actually connecting with the one true God. And I think it's positive transformation. And the Bible talks about that. It says the broken are his people. And it's like the broken are the ones who need positive transformation the most. And they're the ones who generally end up having the closest relationship with God. A lot of people who have easy life, chill life, they don't have as close a relationship with God. And oftentimes you'll find much of their religion or their belief in God is very much just in their head. It's ideas, it's thoughts, it's not as spiritual. And that isn't to say like, oh, go become a drug addict so you can become closer to God. There are much crazier battles that you can fight, such as the battles that Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. fought. And I'll get in, and what's the guy's name? Churchill. I'll get into all that kind of stuff. Oh, I want to talk about the nature of evil too. That shit fucks me up, man. Anyway, So I'll cut this off, but that's the kind of stuff we'll talk about. That's kind of the general approach that I'll take. Use a degree of pragmatism where we're saying, okay, there is this idea of relationship with God. It's something that you can sense and you can feel. We'll define what that looks like, and I kind of have here. I think that we should use an empirical and rational approach as opposed to an empirical or rational approach, and definitely not a purely rational approach. And I want to make a video, maybe I'll make it right now, about how I see a lot of the flaws of rationality emerge in the church, where they're depending on pure reason to understand the nature of God, and so they're kind of just making up bullshit without using material from the world to understand the nature of God. And I think we have to start with observations and not just start with like, oh, God, and then create like an argument for the existence of God. Instead, we should be like, God exists. What is his nature? Is he a conscious being? Is he unconscious? Is God in nature? Is nature God? Or is nature merely a reflection of God? And I'll get into all that crazy. Oh man, I've got some schizophrenic ass ideas about like nature and God. They're not the nature of God, but like nature, like trees and like rocks and God. It's crazy. So we'll get into it. And I'm looking forward to it. But I'll go ahead and make some of these videos right now. Farewell, folks. Enjoy what's to come, maybe.